Troy, thanks so much for coming on the Easy Prey podcast today.
Hey, Chris, thank you very much for having me back.
I'm glad to have you back. It's been over 3 years since the last time you've been on the podcast.
Not much has happened since then, has
No, nothing. There's no worldwide pandemics, no 100 million record data breaches. Nothing like that's happened in the past 3 years.
No, I mean, it's all the world stuff, and then I'm sure we both have a lot of personal stories over that period as well.
That we do. So, for those that don't know who you are, who are listening, what is it that you do?
I've got to give that some thought. I mean, I'm well known for the Have I Been Pwned data breach service, but I do a lot of public speaking. I do travel again now, which is nice, and speak at events. I do a lot of training. I haven't done as much blogging lately because I've been very busy. I do some advisory things. Honestly, like I say to people, this is the honest truth. Like I get up each morning and I just look at what's in my inbox and I kind of figure it out from there. And other than things that are scheduled, like this talk just now, or travel events, it is literally just winging it day by day.
So let's go. So let's go with Have I Been Pwned? Why did you start that? Was it just some sort of, hey, I found this large data set and I want to start playing with it? Or did you have this vision behind starting a service?
There was definitely not a vision. And look, I guess it's like a lot of pet projects where someone builds it on their spare time. They have no expectation of it doing anything. And if I did, I wouldn't have given it such a stupid name. Now I'm stuck with that. I think it's actually worked out okay. But it was after the Adobe data breach. I'd been blogging a bunch about data breaches and some of the patterns we can see. I find it really fascinating that data breaches sort of peel back the covers of what is behind the veneer of the website that we all use. Mm-hmm. And you get to look at it and you go, oh, wow, they did that thing. And look at this data. And those people are in there. And, oh, yeah, I'm in there too. Like I was in Adobe twice, once with my work address and once with my personal address. And I thought that was interesting, being there twice. Also thought it was interesting because as far as I knew, I didn't give Adobe my data. Oh. And I was like, what is Adobe? Like I know what Photoshop is, but as far as I know, I don't really use Adobe products. But I used Macromedia products and Adobe bought Macromedia. So my data flowed through into their database. And I thought that was interesting too. The fact that you can put your data in one place and then it kind of traverses around the internet or the various entities and acquisitions and things, and you end up somewhere you didn't expect.
Yeah, that's pretty crazy. And so that was just kind of your exploring that, which is what started the service?
Yeah, look, it was that. And it was also, I was in a corporate job working for Pfizer. Now, everyone knows who Pfizer is now because of the stuff that's happened since we last spoke. But at the time, they were one of the largest companies in the world. I think the sixth largest company when I joined. Most people didn't know who they were. So I had to be like, hey, do you know what Viagra is? I was like, we make Viagra. And a whole bunch of other drugs. But I was working there and I'd had to go through this transition period, which so many people in technology do, which is where they say, hey, you're a software developer. You seem to be good at that. If you want your career to progress, you got to stop doing that. You got to be like a manager or something. And I hated that. It was miserable. So I wanted a pet project. And I wanted also to, in the new role I was in, to transition this organization into more sort of cloud first development practices, and particularly things around platform as a service kind of models, such as we had in Microsoft Azure. So I wanted to build some stuff, but I wasn't really primarily a developer anymore. So I went, okay, well, I'll just go home and build some stuff. And hey, there's a good data set. Let's just whack an interface on top of that. And I can play with table storage and some of the modern PASI paradigms and build a project. And that was a large part of why Have I Been Pwned was born.
That is hilarious. It was. I love it when people's pet projects become something that's useful to society and helpful, because you weren't thinking, how can I make a boatload of money off this darn thing? No. How can I monetize it?
No, and honestly, like no one's more surprised than me that I'm here talking about it. It's going to be 10 years in December, my 10th birthday. So no one's more surprised than me that I'm here talking about it, that it's become not just a useful service, but a valuable service, that it has given me a lifestyle. That is by no means the way it began. And I think looking back on it, if it had have begun that way, I don't think it would have been as successful as what it was. I was just like, how do I make this as useful and as accessible to everyone as possible? And that's what got it known and got the traction and built it into something that it is today.
Yeah, and I think when people went there and it's like, hey, there's no advertising here. They're not trying to sell me anything. They're not trying to push me anything. Oh, I tend to trust people a little bit more when they're not advertising things.
And look, I mean, that's what's been really, I don't know if challenging is the right word, but something I've approached really, really cautiously in more recent
Yeah.
years is like, how do I do things that do generate revenue for it without it, ramming it down people's throats? So, like the 1Password product placement that's been there, I think since 2017, 2018, that is very subtle. It's very relevant. There are no trackers or privacy invading things. It is the best possible thing I firmly believe that you can do, even preferably before you're in a data breach, but especially once you've discovered you're in a data breach. So trying to find ways to make the service like equally more valuable, but also generate some money to pay for the thing. That's been a very delicate process.
And from let's go down a rabbit hole. We won't talk numbers because I don't think either of us. Well, you're probably more inclined to talk numbers than I am. That's one of the challenges with running a service like that has millions and millions and millions of queries. That it's not the sort of thing that you can spin up on a shared box at your host du jour and it actually function.
But it kind of is, and I guess it's a question of things like cost and performance, and there's this sort of interesting set of sometimes competing objectives. Like, how do I make it fast? How do I make it scalable? How do I make it cost effective? And now is actually an interesting time to talk about this, because one of the things I did very early on that was a great decision was to use Azure table storage, which is just a very, very simple storage construct, really just a key value pair lookup. And this was sort of one of the things that attracted me to building the project in the first place. I was like, I wonder, like, if I put 155 million records in there, which is what I started with, will it actually be fast, and how much will it cost? And it was super fast. It was really, really fast. And it was costing, I can't remember, I think it was like $20 a month or something stupid like that for the storage. And I was kind of curious, over the course of time, how will it perform? So now there's a total of nearly 13 billion breached accounts. And when I say breached accounts, my personal email address has got 30 of those accounts. So this is instances of an email address in a breach. I did a very manual backup the other day, which leads me to where we're going next. And I found there's about 5.5 billion unique email addresses. So we've gone from 155 to about 5.5 billion. And what's been really cool is that when you look at those metrics of things like performance, well, it just has not changed at all. The only time I ever see any change is if I'm absolutely blasting it with data because a new breach is getting loaded. And I haven't seen problems there for a long time. And the cost has gone up a bit, but it hasn't gone up even remotely commensurately to the volume or the usage. So that's, like, I'm just fascinated about how well that lasted. I think I got a bit lucky, if I'm honest.
It sounds like you are. Have you? I know that at some point you switched to using, I think, Cloudflare on the front end to cache and manage the front end.
Yeah, and look, Cloudflare has been amazing for many, many different reasons. In no particular order, that they've given me a whole bunch of services to make available to people for free. So things like the Pwned password service, where you can do password lookups. We're approaching 1 billion passwords in there. We do about 6 billion queries a month. Wow. They host all of that for free. Normally, I'd say our cache hit ratio was around about like the 99.9999%. We found the other day for the last month out of I think it was 6.02 billion requests, there were 0 requests to the origin. So we are now at all the zeros, like it's just 100%. And they give that away for free. So they've been very, very helpful that way. They make a really awesome product as well, just in terms of being a reverse proxy, being able to massively cache, but also block things, create some very, very clever rules, run a lot of code on the edge. I mean, you push like a Cloudflare worker, you're running within seconds on 300 plus different edge nodes around the world. And part of the challenge for me has been, I've got all this Azure stuff there that does a lot of things really good, but there are some things it does really bad. How do I now augment this with Cloudflare to do the things that does really good to fill the gaps of the things it does bad? So, good examples. Egress bandwidth is really, really expensive from Azure. It does that very bad. You can do that very well with Cloudflare if you can cache things and not have to go to the origin. things like their API management tools. Even if people are making way too many requests over their quota, you've still got to service the requests. But now I can start to block those at Cloudflare and not go to the origin. So it's always been a little bit of, how do we dice with the technology to make everything work as well as it can?
Have you shared how many queries you're getting against the platform per hour, day, month?
Yeah, I normally do. Let's have a look. Good question. I haven't looked lately. We can do this in real time. I would be surprised. The whole question of queries is one that becomes a little bit tricky, because it's like, okay, querying what? I mean, I know that I have 200,000 to 300,000 unique visits a day, but that's a combination of individuals and then consumers of the API. Okay, two-factor authentication. I've got to do that. Security gets so far in the way.
We'll get there.
Because it's Windows with a biometric device, I can two-factor my way in with my fingerprint. And as soon as I do that, someone's like,
"Yeah, I was about to say, just don't hold it in front of your camera."
It's a little bit like I do a regular radio piece here in my local city, and yesterday I went in there and they're like, so tell us about this thing where you plug your phone into a charging port in an airport and they take over your phone. It's like, no, it's not really what happens. Some researchers once did it. It's a little bit like fingerprints. They got some gummy bears and they watched some James Bond, but it's not what we really have to worry about. So for Have I Been Pwned, where are we? Keeping in mind that today is it's a Monday on your end. Yeah, 216,000 unique visitors to the haveibeenpwned.com domain. And then normally we see some number of hundreds of thousands of queries to a combination of the API and the front page. And then, of course, there's domain searches and other things as well. Most of the time these days, I just watch some dashboards to see if anything like ticks in a direction I don't think is meant to tick.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean by that.
And it does occasionally. And then I built a rule. I broke something the other day, and I looked at my dashboard much later after I had numerous tickets logged for it, and I was like, oh yeah, look at the big spike of errors. Okay, spread an alert for that.
I did that.
Yeah. You can still see it's like the origins of the pet project are still very clearly there.
Yeah. Yes. Do you get a lot of malicious traffic, or you have a lot of API traffic? So I hesitate to say non-human traffic, but let's call it malicious traffic or unauthenticated, unapproved.
Yeah. And it's almost easier. I think malicious is a good word, actually, because whether or not it's to APIs or scraping the front of the page or whatever it may be. I used to, and there's a few different things that I did that really changed that. So what I used to see is when I first launched it, so it's December 4th, 2013, and it looks like it does today. There's a front page, input box, you put your email address in, and it would make an async request to an API with that email address and return results. And I just put the website out there, not expecting to do anything. It was surprisingly popular. And then I went, oh, okay, well, I should document the API, and then people can start to use that to do good things. So I did that, and people started to use it to do bad things. And, what I meant by bad is I would just see patterns that made me feel like the data wasn't being used in the best interest of the individuals that were being searched for, which is the whole paradox of running a service like this in the first place. So mass enumeration in a sequential order of email addresses on different domains. So I went, okay, well, I'll put in a rate limit so that if you make more than one request every 1,500 milliseconds, you'll get an HTTP 429 and then a retry after header, and you will slow down because that's the semantic intent of that response. And so people would get 429 and then they'd just keep hammering it and hammering it and hammering it. And then they'd go through and then they get a whole range of different IP addresses. And I ended up that was the point actually I rolled to Cloudflare. I went, all right, I'll put it behind Cloudflare because then I can start doing rate limiting at the edge.
Yeah.
Because they were just hammering their service. And my poor little Azure PaaS instance just couldn't keep up, and I'd lose requests. But the problem with rate limiting at the edge is that if you rate limit by IP address, you still have the problem of people going and getting lots of IP addresses. Yeah. And you don't want to just stop bots per se, because bots can be good. If someone builds an application to go and check their corporate email addresses once a week or something, that's a good bot. And then in 2019, which would have been before we last spoke, I ended up just introducing a charge. So look, if you want to query the API, it's $3.50 a month. You will get an API key, and the key is the thing that you need to send with each request. And it doesn't matter if they're all from the same IP, different IP, whatever, but the key is the rate limited thing. And the abuse disappeared entirely.
Yeah.
Like the entire abuse against that API completely disappeared, and it's remained that way to this day because you have to stump up a card to go and buy the thing. And this is why I was actually a little bit supportive of the Elon Musk stuff the other day on Twitter, where he's like, look, we're going to trial new users in New Zealand and the Philippines needing a card, and it's like $1 a year.
Yeah.
Well, I can see the path that takes you there, and then there's a whole other debacle with that. Anyway, so that solved that problem. But what tends to happen is you push the malicious stuff in a different direction.
Yeah.
So there was still an API behind the front page, and I had all sorts of controls on there to try and limit abuse, but people were then abusing the non-documented API, not the one that was now meant to be consumed. Yeah. And it was only earlier this year that I started using Cloudflare Turnstile, which goes through and issues a challenge to the browser. It all happens invisibly. Challenge to the browser. Make sure that you are a legitimate user, and then if you're a legitimate user, you get to call the API. And then the next time you call it, you have to have another challenge, and it's all happening invisibly for more than 90% of people. Then a small fraction end up on a page that does a challenge. So, it's like, okay, we've moved the problem. Now we're going to solve it this way. Now, as far as I know, that hasn't just moved the problem somewhere else so far.
You haven't found where it's moved to, or they haven't found a way to poke at something else.
Well, the thing is, you normally see, so like I'm looking at my charts at the moment, and I can see sort of the volume of requests to APIs. And if it sort of incommensurately suddenly really, really ramps up when it's a rate-limited API, then I know that something funny is going on. But that just doesn't seem to have been happening, which is good.
That's a good thing. So taking a step backwards towards the data breach side of the conversation, which we have gleefully jumped over. Where did you get your first data set, and how has your methodology and where you get your inside secrets come from?
Well, I think what changed is when I launched, it was Adobe, and I think there was like Strat4 and Gawker and a few other little ones, and they were all sort of in fairly broad circulation. I had to go and grab the data and load that in, and it was sort of manual labor on my behalf. And right after it launched, people started popping up and just going, "Hey, I've got the whatever data set just here." And to this day, nearly 10 years on, that's what happens on average every single day. I'd say average is 1 point something times per day. I'll get an email, and I'll wake up and what I get today, I've got a whole bunch of like weird stuff like that, where someone will go, "Hey, without throwing anyone under the bus, it could be anything from, here's a new disclosure of a breach. This one's linked me to a URL that has got the entire dump. I need to go and have a look at that. Apparently it's a German site. I don't know what it is, but I just get stuff like this every single day now. And it's a fire hose of breaches. And honestly, it's much more than what I can even handle. So you imagine the fire hose, and I have to filter that down to just what I can deal with, and then they sort of go into the service, and then eventually I get around to some of the others. And sometimes when it's a little bit quieter, like it has been the last few days, I've loaded breaches from 2019 because I've finally gotten around to dealing with them.
When people are saying, "Hey, I've got this new data set," is it, you're saying 1.1 a day? Is it 1 or 1 point new ones a day? Let's say there's a new data set comes available. Do you have like 10 people say, "Hey, I've got this new data set," or is it pretty much 1 for 1?
Yeah, so sometimes it is, particularly if it appears in public hacking forums, and there's a bunch of people lurking there that obviously support Have I Been Pwned, and I'll get up, and it's always more impactful when you get up because you've had like 8 hours overnight for something to happen, and then there'll be like 3 different messages. "Hey, have you all seen this one?" And there's links to that. Other times it's just an individual that's come across data. Sometimes this is where it kind of gets really awkward as well, but sometimes it's an individual that's taken the data. And that's, oh crap, now I've got to tell them that they really should go to their room and think about what they've done, because normally it's children that have done this as well. And if not children, then very young adults. So there's a there's some awkward conversations there as well.
That's kind of interesting. That I was wondering if, like, okay, the person who's, if they stole the data, why are they giving it to you? That
Yeah,
is
good
it that
question.
is it that there is this altruistic, I have stolen the data because I don't want this company to, I want the world to know that this company is not practicing good hygiene? Or did they steal it because they wanted credit card numbers and they've got that and now they want to feel good about themselves, so they give it to you without the credit card numbers?
It's different motives. Now, I was just as you're saying this, I was thinking something, and I won't name this brand, but it's a brand that you know very well. It's a very large American company. Someone has a website here that they've stood up just to publish this data, and they're like, name a company was breached on the above date due to multiple security oversights, including but not limited to, and then they go on about all this stuff. They've got an entire employee directory that they've dumped, and about 16 gigabytes worth of documents as well. And they've just dumped the whole lot there. Now, this person just appears to be cranky about the security posture of this organization. Yeah. So they've gone, failure to train employees on popular known phishing techniques, ultimately leading to the compromise of the victim's employee accounts, and all these things that's wrong with them. I think that the motives could be anything from, for all we know, this person tried to shake them down for money and they didn't get money, and now they're throwing their toys and they're just like, hey, here's all the data, which we see all the time with ransomware as well, right?
Yeah.
I think sometimes it is altruistic in that they want to see security better and they feel like companies don't take it seriously enough. And part of what pains me with all of this is that sometimes that they're right. Companies just don't take it seriously enough. And the thing that gets their attention is to dump the data. And it shouldn't be that way, but a lot of that falls back on the companies too. But then I'm sympathetic to the companies because they get so many people reaching out the whole time saying, hey, I've found vulnerabilities, and it's a beg bounty. So there's a good term, beg bounty. It's not a bug bounty. It's someone saying, I got one of these a couple of days ago. They'll say, yeah, I've found vulnerabilities in your site. How much will you pay? And then you start having the discussion, and it's like, your SPF records are too permissive. Or it's like, come on, man.
Okay. I'm going to go on a rant. You know, I get those almost every day on some property that I own. I have found a vulnerability in your website. You aren't publishing FPF records to the way I want them published. Well, one, that's not a problem with my website. Like, number two, number three, number four. And you want me to pay for that, and it took you 3 seconds to run it through MX Toolbox.
Yeah, and this is exactly what they're doing, right? They're using tools like that. And that the thing that it's just such a kludgy mess. Like I am critical of organizations that are not receptive to security reports. And I push them to do things like usersecurity.txt and list your contact details, which I do on my services. And then people go and find that and run free tools and give you rubbish reports. And then you have to go through, and you kind of need to take it seriously because I keep telling you should. But then you know it's going to be rubbish. Yeah. So it's a hard problem. I get to the point every time I have one of these discussions, I'm like, well, it's a good industry to be in at the moment, isn't it? Because of stuff like this.
Job security.
I know.
So have the contents of what you're seeing in the data breaches changed over time?
Look, I'd say that probably the most obvious thing that's changed is ransomware has gotten so big in probably the last 5 years, but I feel like particularly the last few years, it's just really, really ramped up. And the prevalence of ransomware crews running dark web websites where they're just like, here's all the data. We've seen this over and over again. Australia had a really, really big, public incident last year where our largest private health insurer literally had somewhere approaching half of the country exposed in this breach. And the ransomware crews were like, I think they wanted $11 million or something, pay the money or we're going to dump it all. And then, of course, they started dumping it all. And the press was just covering it like nothing else. So what's the ransomware crew do? We're going to start by dumping the list of people who've had abortions. And then we're going to dump the list of people who have drug addictions and just maximum impact. And of course, a lot of what's being ransomed is documents. This one here on this well-known US company I've been taking a look at, and it's just troves and troves of emails, Word documents, PDFs that could be everything from invoices to corporate communications. And it used to be that data breaches were like .SQL files and .CSVs, and I think now there's a lot more of like the entire crown jewels of the organization in there.
Ooh. So from the database dumps of non-documents and non-emails and things like that, customer records, are you seeing more fields in those dumps?
I don't know that that's really changed in any material way. And I think perhaps the question to ask is, are we building our applications any differently today than what we were 10 years ago when they started? You know, are we collecting different fields? Well, we're storing our passwords a bit differently. There's, I was going to say there's less MD5, but even yesterday, a loaded data breach was assaulted MD5. You know, that there's more stronger adaptive hashing algorithms, which is great, but it's still like a field with the password and then everything else in clear text. It's always everything else in clear text. And that hasn't changed. Yeah, possibly a few more instances of having things like Stripe IDs instead of payment records because there's other providers you can use. Yeah. We've certainly seen more issues around things like compromises of third parties. In fact, I've lamented quite a bit on Twitter lately. Very often you see disclosure notices and it's like, hey, there's a data breach. It wasn't us. It was a compromise of a third party.
Yeah.
And all right, who was it? It was a third party. Like, well, who did you give my data to? Well, you agreed in the terms and conditions we could give it to whoever we want. I didn't read that. Oh, okay.
Yeah. Who's going to read 85 pages of security disclosure?
No, and look, I have terms and conditions on Have I Been Pwned. I expect that one or two people will read them, and then that will be it. Everyone will just be like, "Yep, fine," because that's just what we do. I would like to see whether we have to regulate this or whether we just say, "Look, this is just common decency." I would like to see disclosure of who the third party was, and what we often see is there'll be some sort of compromise and you'll get half a dozen different organizations going compromise, third party, unnamed, and then one will go, yeah, no, it was these guys. You're like, okay, well.
Okay, so all of you are pointing back to this one guy, even though you didn't say.
Well, yeah, we sort of make assumptions then, but this is part of the fabric of the way we build applications now. You have your chatbot service here and your payment services there and then your ticketing service there. And even for us, we recently did a whole bunch of very boring privacy and legal stuff with Have I Been Pwned? And the lawyers went, look, you have to go through and list every single party you provide the data to. So it's like, okay, Azure and Cloudflare, obviously, but then SendGrid, because we send emails, and Zendesk, because we have a support system and you might enter your data in there. But it's kind of obvious. And I tell you what, if it was, let's say it was Zendesk had a compromise and data that our customers put in there, I'm going to be the first person to go, no, it was Zendesk. It was, I don't care. Like, I'm going to be honest and transparent about it.
I am surprised. I use Zendesk as well, and for a number of projects, and I'm surprised at people's willingness to just throw out all sorts of personal information in a support ticket to someone they've never met before.
Well, it's,
I'm just appalled by like, oh yeah, here's my social security number. I'm like, delete.
I mean, there's a whole other rabbit hole there about why a social security number is such a secret that you give to everyone. Yeah. That's an American problem. We just have driver's licenses. We have the same issue with. We saw a really good example of this just last week where Okta had an incident, and in the Okta support system, they had customers that include 1Password and Cloudflare, where they had provided HAR files from the browser that had material for authentication tokens in it. So the HAR files had everything that you needed to hijack the session, which is fascinating. And maybe that wasn't explicitly like, here's my social security number, but you've still taken a secret and you've put it into a ticketing system and then it's been compromised.
Yeah. And like, I wouldn't know if, I would hopefully hear if Zendesk got compromised, but if someone got into my little store of Zendesk and my tickets, how would I ever know? It's unless there's a public disclosure.
You get an email from me.
Yeah, actually, I probably would. and hopefully I wouldn't be, who are you and why are you pestering me?
Yeah. Anyway.
So do you think, like you were talking about this push for cloud services, do you think that's causing... I shouldn't say cause. Do you think that will result in more of these? Hey, this random undisclosed third party has had a breach, and now rather than it being my data on my premises, it's now hundreds of data or hundreds of clients that were using the platform.
I think cloud in general has massively increased our attack surface, for want of a better word. And I'm hesitant to say it's made us more vulnerable, because I think in many times cloud services can do things a lot better than what you can in your own application. But it has made many, many more points of entry, and that could be anything from there's so many data breaches in Have I Been Pwned because people have used easily accessible, well-priced storage constructs, and they haven't put a password on there. You know, there's a lot of MongoDB and Elasticsearch and S3s and all this sort of thing. And then it's a little bit the same with using other third-party services. You know, if you're, let's say it's Zendesk. If you're using Zendesk and you don't have multi-factor authentication, you're reusing your password, well, you've now got a great big attack surface sitting there that could be very easily accessible and could contain some very sensitive things.
Yeah. Oh, it's also scary, messy. Where do you see? Yeah, it's a great job security. Where do you see the kind of the future going? Emerging technologies, strategies, things like that might shift how we look at data breaches or how they're happening, or how we secure against them.
We're definitely making good progress away from passwords. I feel like we've really started to gather momentum, maybe even just in the last year. I mean, things like passkeys, for example, we're seeing passkeys referred to much more frequently. I was listening to the radio, like for normal people the other day, and they're talking about passkeys. So I think that's always a good sign. Even things like I wouldn't say ubiquity, but a greater acceptance of things like universal two-factor. I even set my father somehow manages to keep resetting his Gmail password because he's trying to log on to some model boat site or something, and he's confused between what's a Google account and what's the account for the website. And I'm like his security contact, so I get these notifications saying, "Hey, password's just been reset." And I'm always like, "Hey, Dad, was this you?" So the other day I was like, "I'm taking away all your privileges. I'm turning on Google Advanced Authentication or Google Advanced Protection. I've got you 2 YubiKeys. I'm going to enroll them both. The only way you can ever log back in, other than the device I log you in, is with these keys. So now this is not going to happen again." Also, if you're like overseas and you lose your device, you need to access your email, you're screwed.
Yeah. Or you lose the YubiKey.
Yeah, but I have the YubiKeys.
Okay.
and I have 2, and I have them in different locations, and I protect them very, very carefully. And look, there are account recovery processes. And I think this is sort of one of the interesting things about using U2F like this. It works really, really well when you have access to everything. And then by design, it's really, really hard, but not impossible when you don't have access to them.
So has your view and thoughts on 2FA shifted over the years? I don't remember where our discussion was 3 years ago on, SMS via authenticator app via fingerprint, retinal, hand, or physical token.
And look, I wrote about this probably before we spoke last time about two-factor and sort of the hierarchy of SMS and soft tokens and U2F. Really, I don't think we see many hard tokens generating numbers these days. And it was, I think there's like a lot to unpack there. First of all, SMS 2FA is not terrible. Having no 2FA is terrible.
Yeah.
Like adding a second factor is great. I think it's quite interesting. I often see people say, using SMS for 2FA is even worse than not having 2FA at all. I'm like, no, it's not. You can't do maths. It's like okay, call it 1.5 FA if you must, but it is always adding something. And I think what people often mean is very, very frequently you see that once there is a phone number attached to an account, that can be used as a single factor for recovery, which is a concerning thing. But that's a bit of a kludgy mess on behalf of the provider. So using a phone number is always a step forward. And for many people, particularly less technical people, that's probably the best way to do it. Because if they end up with an authenticator app, it's only just recently Google Authenticator started actually allowing you to sort of back that up and restore it to another device. What happens if you lose your authenticator app? U2F keys, you've got a financial burden, and then you have to have it on you. You need to know what you're doing with that. So I think all of those are very, very relevant. And look, things like passkeys are a really good step forward because we can sort of start to move away from this dependency of terrible passwords, but then you're syncing them somehow. So if someone gets access to the device where you're syncing them, well, then that's a different problem. You mentioned biometrics. I think biometrics as a second factor, like the way I just logged onto Cloudflare, is awesome. I have to be at this machine using this device This is not James Bond. Someone's not going to gummy bear my fingers into a new prosthetic and log on from the other side of the world. They're fantastic. I biometric into all of my things now. I've got iPhone, iPad, new laptop, PC with an external reader. It's great because I can also authenticate without anyone seeing the secret, which is great.
Yeah, I like options. For me, it's always what is the second factor authentication mechanism that this person can tolerate doing without it destroying their life.
And, even then, I think it depends. To give you an example, we keep talking about Zendesk. One of the things that really bugs me with Zendesk is they want you to 2FA in very regularly. When I think about, let's say, my Twitter, and to me, Twitter is enormously valuable because there's so many DMs with very sensitive discussions. I 2-factor into that only with security keys. I tweaked all this the other day. No soft tokens, anything like that, security keys. Now, how often do I have to enter that security key? It's really every time I set up a new device, which in the scheme of things is not that frequent. Zendesk, very frequently, I have to enter the second factor. So, it's the same device, same IP address, same browser heuristics, all this, but I have to enter the second factor. Okay, well, then that makes more sense to have a soft token in my password manager because then I can take that barrier of friction down to basically zero. Otherwise, it's like, okay, now I've got to pull out my phone, I've got to get the Authy app, I've got to get the token, and it's just painful. So I think we've all got to find where our sweet spot of usability and security is as well.
And understanding, for me, on the more sensitive, the more financially valuable, I'm willing to go through more pain and more hassle to keep that secure than I am something else. I won't say what that something else is, but
that's almost like a risk-based assessment, isn't it? So there are different risk levels to different things. What do I actually need to really, really carefully protect, and what level of inconvenience am I willing to bear? I think the U2F keys are a perfect example. I mean, you just, short of a Genesis market style thing where someone's actually selling your browser fingerprints and your cookies, your post-auth, you're just not getting into an account that has U2F enabled without actually having the U2F key. And I love that. And I've just got a process for the way I manage my keys and the keys of my family because I have family members using it as well.
Have you had, I don't want to get too into the weeds with family. Have you had these types of discussions with kids, and are they as security conscious as you are, or more or less security acceptance?
Yeah, so my kids, my son's 14 and my daughter's 11, and they've grown up seeing what I do, but also traveling a lot with me, coming to events, being on stage themselves. So I guess they get to kind of live in that world. So they have a pretty good understanding of it. They've had password managers since forever. So they're all part of my 1Password family account. We have lots of shared vaults between my wife and the kids. And it's like my wife and I have a shared vault with my son, and we have a separate shared vault with my daughter. And then we have a family shared one. And then she and I have one. So we can all sort of exchange secrets and things backwards and forwards as we need to. So for them, that's very normal, that workflow. When we come off air, I'll tell you a fun story actually about the way I've used U2F keys, but that's not for that's not for rebroadcast for reasons you'll hear about soon. But they're starting to understand that, and they understand things like why we need multi-factor. Because they're already in that password manager ecosystem, it's very easy for them to set up one-time passwords in 1Password by adding that in for the various sites they use. So I think there's sort of this benefit for them being that term we often use, that the digital natives, where they've just grown up with this. That's been their life, right?
And then the flip side would be parents, where there's this constant pushback, and I don't want to understand the technology, let alone do I actually understand it sometimes.
It's kind of interesting, and my parents are of a demographic, they're in their mid-70s, where obviously they didn't grow up with this. It's something that they've had to learn over time. My father was a pilot, so he was used to being very technical and in control of, I guess, complex machinery. So he grasped it reasonably well. But going back to the Gmail story the other day, when he came over and I was like, just help me understand what you did the other day. And he's gone to this place he orders his model boat batteries or whatever from. and it's like log in with Facebook, log in with Google, log in with email. And then I think what he's done is he's gone log in with email, and then he's entered all these Gmail credentials
Yeah.
into the, and I looked at it and went, that is confusing. Like it is really confusing. So if you're not like not a digital native like our kids, but not someone who got to sort of spend all their adulthood working with technology, it's confusing for me. So it must be for you. I think finding the right technology fit so my mother often just writes passwords in a password book, which, like a physical book. And that's fine so long as they're unique. Like her threat actor is someone who can break into the house. And the person who wants to break in the house wants to take your TV, right? Like not the notebook in your drawer. So I think we've got to sort of find what is the right technology for the right demographic, and what's something that they can use and be comfortable with as well, because you also don't want people to just be completely lost every time they go to buy a battery for a boat.
Yeah, I mean, you want their online experience to be a positive online experience and not so difficult that they're just like, forget it. I'm just not going to buy a battery for my boat. I'm not going to enjoy my boating anymore because it's not worth it anymore.
No, and I do wonder if as an industry, and I've thought this for a very long time actually, if we've done ourselves a bit of a disservice by being able to have social provider logins, because it is super confusing and you do delegate a lot of visibility to third parties. But then if you create an account for every single website, people are reusing that same lousy password absolutely everywhere as well. So you got a different problem.
Do you find yourself creating fewer accounts because of what you do?
No, YOLO. I've got like 1,000 accounts. I have so many accounts, but I do have a strong and unique password for every single account. I think, particularly given the pandemic situation, but also just societally, we buy so much stuff online these days. We're always buying stuff online, and we're always creating more accounts. Just yesterday, I wanted to get like a solar radiation sensor for a weather station. Well, there's a website that sells those. So, okay, well, I guess I need another account. So there's another like wild wacky password that's gone into there. One other account, one other place that I might have my name and password I don't care about because it's strong and unique, but my my home address or my phone number or the last 4 digits of my card or something exposed. But am I not going to buy stuff? No, it's like that's just a risk we take on board.
Do you find yourself providing less optional informational fields when creating accounts?
Yeah, there's just, you don't often have a lot of optional fields.
True.
I also think we need to have a little bit of a sort of a discussion about what is actually the risk of some of the data classes we provide as well. I feel that people get incommensurately concerned about their email address, their home address, and their phone number. I know they feel very personal, but remember, most of that is stuff that we've had in phone books for decades. And I regularly get people send me a message where I've gone out the back and it looks awesome, so I've taken a photo and I've put it on Twitter, and then some well-intentioned person will DM me and I'll say something like, look, you just took this photo. I've looked at the angle of the sun and how high the tide was and the buildings, and I think I've managed to triangulate your address. I'm like, why don't you just use the phone book, man? Like, why are you making life so hard? As if it's some massive secret. And I think that's just one of these cases where we get incommensurably worried about the exposure of a piece of data that doesn't really have real world impact most of the time. Of course, there are exceptions, but people will find your address if they want to.
Yeah. And that's one of those things that's probably on some public record anyway, that's not even behind any authentication whatsoever.
I mean, in Australia, you're in a phone directory by default. If you have any sort of business dealings and you're a director of a company, of which I certainly am, you're in the book there. There's just lots of other. You could easily figure out the schools my kids go to. You could easily follow me home. Like it'd be so easy to find this information if you wanted to. And if you're more worried about people just casually discovering it, well, I'm sort of less worried about the intent of people casually discovering it.
Yeah. I wonder if that's a good spot to stop.
It's not as bad as it seems.
Yeah, no, I mean, but I think there is a point to that where it's like we shouldn't panic about the data that's out there. Yes, if it's the password to your retirement account, yeah, you should be concerned about that. If it's something that all your neighbors know about you anyway,
Well, yeah, I think also a fair comment to make here is that in many ways we have the luxury of it not mattering. To me, it doesn't matter too much if someone discovers my address. It also doesn't matter too much if they discover my gender or my sexuality, because they're not things that are particularly sensitive to me. But I recognize that there are people out there for whom that could be very damaging. So I'm reticent to say it doesn't matter at all, but I do think that in the vast majority of cases, the real world impact is extraordinarily limited, but it can be very important to some people.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. You were talking earlier about medical record data breaches.
Yeah,
That is in many cases extremely personal. If I broke my ankle, I don't really care if people know whether I broke my ankle or not. But if I got a procedure that may or may not be socially acceptable, or that I may not want people to know about, then that becomes highly sensitive, highly charged. You just can't say all medical data, it's no big deal if you broke your ankle, because that's not always what it is.
Well, that's why it's generally classified as sensitive personal information. And if I think back through my medical history, I can't think of anything where if it was all public, it would matter too much. But again, for many people, it would. It could be deeply personal, deeply sensitive things there. That's certainly something which is very different for other people.
And I guess that's where we, as people in the field talking about data breaches, we have to be careful that we don't minimize any particular field. For someone, it could be important. If someone is being stalked, for example, their address is very relevant.
It is. And I guess my hesitation there is that we're trying to filter out and almost cast a judgment ourselves on whether or not something should actually be important to them. Because there are plenty of times where someone absolutely loses their mind over the exposure of a piece of data that actually has no impact on them. They're not a persecuted minority or anything like that. They're just pissed because someone exposed their data. Yeah. Which is also okay, in many ways.
Which is also not always a bad thing to be upset about. This company that should have been doing a better job wasn't doing a better job. Do you see things, a trend of things getting better? No. I was hoping for a nice positive end to this.
I see things just changing, right? So, I mean, the password situation is a good example. There are more times where we're using bcrypt to store our passwords than MD5, so it's harder to crack passwords. But I mentioned Genesis Market before, taken down by the FBI and friends earlier this year, because it's getting harder to brute force credential stuff your way past accounts that might have strong unique passwords or might have multi-factor authentication. Well, what if we've got malware that can just take the browser fingerprints and the cookies post auth? Okay, well, it's just moved the field along. We've seen things like multi-factor authentication bombing, where people just get prompted over and over and over and over again to accept the login, and eventually they're like, just make it go away. So, all right, well, we changed the model. Now you've got to enter the number that's showed on the app before you can authenticate yourself. So I think we keep changing the playing field, but I don't think that if we look at it holistically, it's any better today than what it was, let's say, the last time we spoke.
So we just need to do better.
Well,
as consumers and businesses, those just need to start trending we hope those are trending in the right way.
We will, and then the bad guys will do better, and then we'll do better, and it's a good industry to be in. I go back to there again.
So before we stop recording, any parting advice, in addition to use a password manager, use two-factor authentication, what else would you add to that list?
I think what people need to appreciate is just how low the bar is for most of the adverse security incidents that people suffer from. And I use an IRL analogy. We had a situation earlier this year where we were doing some renovations in our house, and we had to leave our car out the front of the house. And due to a series of unfortuitous events, we left the car out the front, and we also couldn't close the gate into our house. And I went down in the morning and I got in the car and I was like, why is the glove box open? And there's just like stuff all over the seat. And I'm like, also, why didn't I have to unlock the car when I got in? So I've immediately pulled the security footage out. And of course, someone has driven past. So I've gotten out. They've opened the door to our unlocked car, which how often do I do that? They've gone in there. They've taken my pocket knife out of the glove box. They've spent 5 minutes trying to figure out how to open it because it was hard. And then they've seen the open gate, and with their knife in the hand, they've walked through the open gate into a house. And I'm just like, oh, I'm such a freaking idiot. And there were good reasons. Well, there wasn't a good reason why the car's unlocked. I screwed that up. But we just had new tiles laid. The gate wouldn't close because they were a little bit higher. All these things happen. And we've got this sort of WhatsApp group for our community here. And you keep seeing people report petty theft. And every single time, it's the low-hanging fruit. You know, someone got dropped off by a car service from the airport the other day, and the car service left the car running while he took their bags inside. And you should be able to do this. But if you do, that's low-hanging fruit. A lady ran inside to drop off a library book, left the car running out the front. Well, you know, there you go. So, what could we do differently? Lock your car, put it inside the garage. Most of us have a garage here. Close your doors. We have a safe for the keys. So if anyone gets into the house, they don't get the keys. And really, having a password manager and multi-factor authentication is that. Like the vast majority of the adverse security incidents that individuals experience just disappears. And it's so simple. It's just like locking your door.
I like that there is a certain level of hope of like, look, if you do these very simple things, you've eliminated, let's say 95%, 90% of what could happen to you.
Yep. Yeah, totally. It's just, I don't think it's that hard.
That is an encouraging stopping point. Troy, thank you so much.
That's the positive note. If you're doing those things, you're almost certainly fine, and there's just a little bit left after that.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Thanks, mate. Thanks for having me back.